Hello, everyone. Welcome, everybody, to a new City-REDI seminar. Today, we have with us Bertha Rohenkohl from the University of Sheffield. Bertha holds a PhD in economics from the University of Sheffield and a double master in economic development and growth from the University of Warwick and Lund University in Sweden. Today is going to be presenting part of her PhD thesis that she defended successfully in 2020. He is presenting a paper on intergenerational income mobility in the UK. She is now working as a postdoctoral research associate at the Center for Regional Economic and Enterprise Development at the Management School at the University of Sheffield. So Bertha, now you have around 30-35 minutes to present the paper, and then we are asking everyone to hold the questions, and we will give the floor to the audience to ask questions and discussions afterwards. Thank you very much. So Bertha, now the floor is yours.
Okay, thank you. Thank you for inviting me here today. And as Raquel was saying, I will present this part of my PhD that focuses on estimating income mobility in the UK. So let me just see if this is working. Yeah. In this presentation, I'm hoping to talk you through some of the main concepts and the motivation for studying this topic. I'll tell you a little bit about the UK context, the study, the aims and contributions, and then a little bit about my data and methods, and present to you the results from my national estimates and then from my regional estimates. So let's crack on. So what do we mean by the term intergenerational mobility? It is one aspect of social mobility and refers to the extent to which an individual's socioeconomic outcomes in adulthood are related to family and parental background. So there are many ways that you can study social mobility from the occupational perspective or of educational outcomes or health outcomes. But as economists, we tend to focus on income mobility or earnings mobility because this is an essential element of economic mobility, and they're usually correlated to many of the other outcomes. So in this study, I will investigate whether coming from a relatively more advantaged or disadvantaged family may define children's opportunities or outcomes in adulthood. So to start with, it is useful to distinguish between two types of intergenerational mobility. We have the absolute mobility and relative mobility. So in this picture on the upper panel, you can see a representation of absolute mobility, which refers to changes in the absolute value of income and earnings across generations. So here we have the parents. This is supposed to be like a ladder or an escalator. So the parents in the lower part, and then their kids, they moved up. They are in the upper part of the ladder. When we talk about relative mobility, as you can see in the lower part of this figure, we are talking about changes in the relative position of people, of individuals in the distribution. So one example of upwards mobility would be the green kid is here now in a better position than the parents were. And on the other hand, we could have the blue person is in a worse position than the parents initially were. So when we talk about relative intergenerational mobility, there are two sides of this. There is upwards mobility and there is downwards mobility. The focus of this study is more on relative mobility, but I'll talk a little bit about absolute upward mobility later as well. So why does this matter? Why do we care about social mobility and intergenerational mobility? Well, it is usually considered one indicator of equality of opportunities. And equality of opportunities is an important aspect of inclusive growth, where people should have equal life chances regardless of their initial conditions. So this term usually refers to the belief that a person's chances to prosper in life, for example, to receive a high quality education or to get a good job, should be unrelated to ascribed characteristics like gender or the ethnic group that they belong to, or to socioeconomic origins. And we might care about equal opportunities for instrumental reasons, so that the full potential of society can be utilized and realized, and meaning that no talents would be missed or no investment and business opportunities are missed because people didn't have opportunities to pursue it, but also because it is seen as a fair and a desirable outcome of society, where fairness means that hard work and talent are rewarded rather than inherited advantages. So this comes in play when we talk about the policies that say that they want to level the playing field. So low levels of intergenerational mobility is both a cause and a consequence of higher inequality of outcomes here of income, for example. There is this inequality trap where these two things, income inequality and low intergenerational mobility, they reinforce each other. And to break that, you'd have to tackle one of the sides to break the cycle. There is an interesting empirical relationship that has been observed, which is called the Great Gatsby curve, that shows a negative relationship between intergenerational earnings mobility and income inequality, meaning that when here, for example, you have countries on the upper left side here, the Scandinavian countries, Denmark, Norway, Finland, Sweden, that have very low income inequality, but they have very high earnings mobility. On the other side of this picture, of the spectrum, we have countries like Brazil, my home country, where we have a very high income inequality and a very low earnings mobility. The UK, or here Great Britain, is in the middle with a lower than average earnings mobility and a higher than average income inequality. So this relationship has been observed for many countries, and it's obviously not, we cannot know which way the causality goes here, but it's just interesting to see that they usually go together. So for the UK, we know that there have been persistent high levels of income inequality, especially since the 80s. And the UK is usually classified as a country with relatively low intergenerational mobility by international standards. Here we have a figure that shows this measure of intergenerational earnings elasticity or earnings mobility between fathers and sons. So the higher this measure, the less mobility the countries have. Great Britain is here in the more than the middle, and all these countries to the left would have better social mobility prospects than Great Britain. But pictures like this, they're usually based on one or two studies that we have up to date. And this existing evidence for the UK is currently dated, so we need to come up with some more estimates for this. In addition, comparisons are very tricky, both between countries and within, for studies for the UK, because of some reasons that I'll tell you in a bit. So the existing evidence for the UK is very largely heavily based on two surveys, the NCDS and the BCS. There are two cohort studies that interviewed people born in 1958, and the BCS is for people who were born in a certain week in the 1970 year. And these studies, they have been used to argue that we have a trend of declining earnings mobility or income mobility in the UK, which is in this paper. But this finding has been, is a little bit of a debate because it's based on 2 points in time. We don't know if that's enough to establish a trend. And the data sets are not super comparable. So the results that we have up to now on intergenerational mobility in the UK, they're very wide-ranging across studies and very difficult to compare. We have extensive data requirements needed to do this type of analysis that make it difficult to do it with any data sets. So the main data sets that have been used, the NCDS, the BCS, and there are other more recent studies, they all have different variables, different ways of measuring things that make it difficult to compare. And these studies have also been using different estimation methods. It's not always clear that they're talking about the same outcome of interest. It's not always clear how people are getting their measure of long-run income or earnings, or if they are comparable across the studies. So just for you to have an idea, I looked into the studies that use the NCDS, and usually this estimate of earnings mobility, it has a minimum value of 0 and a maximum value of 1 theoretically. And in these studies, we have been finding that the estimates are in the range between 0.1 and 0.6. So they go almost through all the interval, making it difficult to establish where is the UK. So if you see 0.1, we would be like Denmark. If we are in 0.6, we are like Hungary or Luxembourg. So all these countries are in this range from 0.1, from 0.6. How do we know where the UK actually is? So a key conclusion from this debate is that much richer data is needed than that from the NCDS and BCS, and that we need new ways of estimating this. So in this study, I estimated the generational income mobility for the UK for a younger generation born after the 1970, and using new data from the British Household Panel Survey, the BHPS, and Understanding Society Survey. And then I unpacked the national estimates to look at geographical variation and income mobility. The contributions are updated and improved estimates for cohorts of individuals born from 1973 to 92. I look into the household and individual income perspectives. I use a new method to address some of the common estimation biases, and I provide new regional estimates. So the data that I used is from the BHPS, and the BHPS has been continued into the Understanding Society. So there is a way of harmonizing these two surveys, and we come up with this very long 27-year panel data set that represents a longitudinal household sample. They have been interviewed from 91 to 2017. And in this data set, it is possible to link parents and children, so we can link these two generations within the same data set and observe income for individuals from the two generations. So we have a matched sample of parents and children, which were born, the children were born between 1973 and 92. So it's more recent than the previous studies that have used the BCS, that they were all born in 1970. Here we can, these students, they can be matched to the biological parents within the survey. And income is observed at least once after the age of 25 in adulthood, and parental income is observed at least once in childhood. These at least once, they're only conditions for the eligibility of the sample, but in reality, we have more observations than this. And I'll tell you a little bit more in a second. So the income variables in this data set, they come directly from the individuals themselves. They are not retrospective information, which is very important to avoid recall errors. We can have multiple observations of income for both generations. So we have these children born here, they're 0 in 1973 to 1992. Then the childhood, during their childhood, we observe parental income between the ages of 0 and 18 in multiple years. And then we observe the income for these children in adulthood after the age of 25, which is when they probably have already finished higher education, if that was the route that went through. So we end up with 2,000, around 2,000 pairs of individuals, but this corresponds to more than 15,000 observations of income for the parents and more than 13,000 observations of income for the children in adulthood, which is on average 6 or 7 per individual. To measure mobility, then we have, as I told you before, we had absolute and relative mobility. And to measure relative mobility, which is the main aim here, we have 2 ways of doing it. One is looking at incomes. So we get estimates of these intergenerational elasticities. And another way is looking at the position of people in the income distribution, just looking at the rank coefficients. So here, just to remind you, we're interested in how closely an individual's or a child's position in the economic ladder is tied to the parent's position. So for the intergenerational elasticities, we measure the difference in the log outcomes between children of high versus low income parents. Usually this is done using traditional OLS regression, where on the left-hand side, you have a measure of the log income of the child. Whenever I say child, I mean child in adulthood. And then on the right-hand side, we have a measure of the parental income. And our main coefficient of interest is beta, will be our intergenerational elasticity. The higher that coefficient, the lower social mobility we have or income mobility we have. And when looking at this model, we need to address 2 estimation concerns to avoid bias in this coefficient. There is the problem of transitory shocks to income. So to avoid this, we use the multi-year observations of income. And there is a problem that we need to compare people at similar points in life. So it's not good if you compare a person who is 25 or 30 and their parents' income was captured when they were 60. That doesn't make much sense. We want to have comparable a comparable point in the life cycle here. So to do that, we control or adjust for age and cohort effects. Here I just have the model as I estimated it with a multi-year average of real income for individual I on the left-hand side, and then the multi-year average on the right-hand side, and including the age and cohort controls. Another way of doing this, so in this data set, when you use OLS, it collapses all the multi-year observations to the average. However, in this literature, there is an extensive debate that there is an age income profile, and depending on when you measure income, that could affect your results. So to use all the information that we had, the specific year and the specific age at which each of these incomes was measured, I come up with a way of using a 2-stage approach to measure this. So in the first stage approach, we regress the income on age and time dummies and obtain the age adjusted income, which is the residual from this regression. So in the second stage, I then use these residuals for both parents and children to obtain the intergenerational elasticity based on these age adjusted incomes. We can talk about this later if anyone wants. I'll just go through this a bit quickly. So the rank coefficients is a similar way to the elasticities. Instead of using the log of incomes, we use the position that these people are in the income distribution. So it's a correlation between the children's and parents' percentile ranks in the distribution. It can be estimated using either the OLS or the 2-stage approach. And the rank estimates are less sensitive to the treatment of zeros, which is usually a problem with the logged incomes, and less affected by the common sources of bias. So my first results here are the national estimates for the UK, the intergenerational elasticity using both methods, and the rank coefficients using both methods. From here, I just want to show you the results using OLS and TSRA were very similar for both. And it gives us an estimate that for every additional or reduced 10% of parental income advantage, we expect that 2.5 to 2.7% will be passed to the next generation. And that a 10-point increase in the percentile rank of parents translates into a 3 points increase in the percentile rank of children. In this table here, I did it with using other measures of income. So the first estimates that I showed you, they were using household income for both generations. And in here we have in the second row estimates using household income for the parental generation, but then labor earnings for the second generation, and then personal income for the second generation. Personal income includes labor earnings plus non-labor sources of income, for example, pensions or benefits or investments. And in the household income, it is similar to the personal income, but it aggregates everyone that's inside that household. So it's interesting here, they're obviously not directly comparable. There are different normative implications from these, looking at these different measures. So we obtained slightly higher elasticities for labor and personal income that could be related to the fact that some people are not employed, for example, and that comes out more strongly when you have the individual measures of income. And we also had a slightly higher mobility based on ranks, but on average, they're pretty similar still. One advantage of using household income, which was the reason I decided to use this as my preferred estimates, was that I wanted to include women. So traditionally, these studies, they are based on pairs of fathers and sons. Only more recently, we started to include mothers, and then we had mothers and fathers and comparing to the sons. But it's only in the past few years that we're starting to see some measures of income mobility for women as well. And the reason for that is that when you look at earnings or income for women, there's always the issue of the lower female labor force participation that complicates. We have a lot of missing values for women, or they're different because we have different part-time work patterns for women, especially around this age that we want to measure here because of children and etc. So it is important to know that measures based on individual income are not directly comparable for men and women, but on household income, they are a bit better. And the results that I have from this paper show that the estimates are not statistically significantly different for men and women or for sons and daughters. So the main results of these models, they were robust to a bunch of things that I tried: sample restrictions, model specifications, and treatment of outliers. There was no indication of non-linearities in this relationship. And so this leads us to the conclusion that the elasticities that we found were smaller than what had been found by previous studies using the latest BCS cohort born in 1970. But only slightly smaller, and that rank coefficient was actually very, very similar to this study from 2017 that used the British cohort study. So was there no big change since the 90s? Because before, people were saying there has been this declining trend in social mobility, but perhaps that has stayed constant since the 70s or since the 90s. Anyways, the UK is still less mobile than Nordic countries comparing to these recent studies that had some comparable estimates here, and more mobile than the US. Just another part of this paper looked into the regional estimates. So the reason behind this is, do we think that one measure is comprehensive enough? We know that there is a large regional variation observed for other countries. We know that there is deep regional inequalities within the UK. And the Social Mobility Commission has already shown that there were a lot of differences in terms of intragenerational mobility, of opportunities across the country with hotspots and cold spots of social mobility, suggesting that a social mobility postcode lottery, as they call it, does exist. So how does income mobility vary across the UK? Using this data, I could calculate the two measures here. The relative mobility that I will show is similar to what I just showed you before, how closely one's position is related to the parent's position. And then we could also calculate a measure of absolute mobility to look at to what extent individuals are better off than their parents in the different regions. So to do this, I use this measure, the absolute upward mobility, that shows us the mean rank of the children whose parents are at the 25th percentile of the national income distribution. So by using the national income distribution to look at the different regions, we avoid the problem of comparing regions that are traditionally rich with regions that are traditionally poor, because that would just give us like some weird apples to oranges comparison. Keeping this distribution constant, we're able to look into these differences between the regions. So the first regional estimates that I had, well, just looking at differences between the north and the south of England. Perhaps if I show you here, it will be easier. So the higher the rank, the steeper is this line. So for the north here, which is the blue line, we have a very steep relationship. So it's a low intergenerational mobility. And while for the south, we have a flatter line, which means we have a lower coefficient and a high intergenerational mobility. And this difference was very significant statistically. And when looking at absolute mobility, we can check here, for example, the parents. If your parents were in the 25th percentile of the national income distribution, someone who was born or who grew up, here I'm talking about a region of upbringing, so someone who grew up in the north of the country would end up around the 40th percentile, the 38.16 percentile, while someone who was born to the same kind of parents based on the national distribution and they grew up in the south of the country, they would end up in the 51 percentile of the income distribution. That's quite a big difference, reflecting differences in opportunities. The next stage was looking into more disaggregated regions. So here I have the dark blue regions showing lower mobility areas or high rank coefficient areas. The highest one was in Yorkshire, Sheffield. That's not a good thing. It's just a very low mobility here in the north. So we had 0.44, while in the southeast, for example, we had a rank coefficient of 0.16. That's almost like 3 times smaller. So the southeast could be comparable to Denmark, and the Yorkshire could be compared to, I don't know, worse than the UK average, almost getting to the Brazil side, which is a bit crazy. Then we have West Midlands that I just put here for this presentation, kind of in the middle of these two worlds. So we see kind of a divide between the north and south, like I already showed you, but there seems to be also a divide between the northeast and the southwest here, northwest here, sorry, here and here. So this was relative mobility. Now we have a picture of absolute mobility. In this one, the good outcomes or the positive things is to be a dark color. So the dark orange means high upward mobility. So when your parents are at the 25th percentile, someone who's born in London would end up at the 56th percentile of the distribution. Someone who grew up in Yorkshire would end up only in the 31st percentile. This is like a 28 percentile difference, which would correspond roughly, back of the envelope calculation, to like £1,000 a month difference in your household income. It's quite a big difference. And West Midlands again in the middle. So we have looking at these maps, we see that the regions with high relative mobility tend to present high absolute mobility as well. And in the southern regions of the country, the gap between children from disadvantaged and advantaged family backgrounds is smaller, and children have more opportunities of disadvantaged parents have more opportunities for upwards movement, as shown by the 25th percentile calculation. There are two related studies that are very recent on this regional estimation of income mobility. One is the study by Bell and co-authors, who looked into occupational, education, and housing mobility across regions in the country, but they didn't have information on income. So although it's related, we would expect it to be somehow related to occupational, educational mobility, as indeed is the case. We cannot directly compare. The other study is a recent report, September 2020, by the Social Mobility Commission on earnings mobility of sons, only sons, at the local authority level. So they do go a bit lower in the sense, in the regional sense, but they didn't manage to look at daughters in their data. And they only had one way of looking at parental income, which was, instead of having a direct observation of income, they had to proxy income by using free school meal eligibility at age 16. So it's not a perfect measure, but what they show is that there are even further variations within these regions that I showed you, as you would probably perhaps expect. But is the picture more complex? I think that up to now, the evidence is inconclusive. We think that it might be, but we don't actually know. And one interesting thing was that observing the findings from the Social Mobility Commission, I think, if I can remember right, like 80–90% of the regions that they flagged as low social mobility regions, or low earnings mobility regions, they were in the north of the country. So that would be in line with what I was finding here as well. And why do we have this regional variation? We don't know. Two other studies for the US and Italy have shown that regions with high relative and absolute mobility area tend to have less residential and financial segregation, less income inequality, less family instability, and better primary schools and more social capital in general. But we don't have this for the UK yet. And this report by the Social Mobility Commission examines a hypothesis that there are inequalities in education across the country. But interestingly, what they show is that in the most mobile areas, education seems to be a bridge that would close this gap between disadvantaged and advantaged families. However, in the least mobile areas, like in Yorkshire, even people with the same education would end up with very different outcomes, and there is a big part of this gap that remain unexplained. That would mean that factors beyond education could be very important here at the local level. Just to finalize the presentation, some summary findings. We get new estimates for the UK, for income mobility in the UK, using the harmonized BHPS and Understand the Society. We had these two preferred national estimates using household income to allow us to include daughters in the estimation. The estimates were a little bit smaller than what was previously found for other studies, but the ranks were very similar, which indicates that perhaps there is not a declining trend anymore, no significant change since the 90s. And the UK is still relatively immobile by international standards. We have income mobility very similar for sons and daughters, robust to a lot of stuff. And just to end this, where you grow up matters. There seems to be a postcode lottery in England. The north and south divide is very clear, but is the picture more nuanced? We don't know. We need more data to find out. And yeah, just some points of reflection. How could we extend this work in the future? We need to obtain estimates for smaller geographical areas, but how can we estimate this in a good way, paying attention to the common estimation biases. What kind of data can we use? One thing that is very unclear here is that we usually talk about the region of upbringing. So all this north and south and region stuff is based on the region of upbringing, but we know that people move. We have no idea how that affects this kind of estimations. Is that a big difference between people who move and people who don't move? And we still know very little about the situation of women and the situation of daughters, and even less about how this differs between ethnic minority groups or ethnic groups. So I think that's it, and I'll hopefully we'll have some time for some questions. Thank you.
Oh, thank you very much, Bertha. I think that it was fascinating, and I will ask you to stop sharing your screen so then we can see everybody. And I have seen a lot of discussion already in the chat, so I'm going to ask maybe John Godard or John. Do you want to formulate a question?
Yeah. It's in the chat.
Yeah.
And I can't remember exactly. Just let me open the chat to put I see the question that I put. Hang on, just a second. Oh, is a number of questions.
Oh, we have lost John. So Lucy, maybe Lucy wants to formulate the question that also was sharing with John. So Lucy Robson, please.
It was something about, people movement, I think, which I think Bertha kind of came on to after we sort of had that exchange. Yeah, how much people moved. Because anecdotally, I'm very curious about a particular place I lived and thinking back, because my brother and I feel like we earn less than some of those people that we grew up with that have stayed in Yorkshire. But, that's probably possibly about the cost of living, but also, the type of work they would do, their parents were doing, the sort of a manufacturing industries that they were doing, and now the children are kind of business people. So, it sort of contradicts what you're saying, but it's just, it's very interesting for me to hear about the kind of Northeast perspective. Yeah, and if geographical movement, I did make any difference, because maybe it's the careers me and my brother have chosen.
Yeah. So the idea here is that where you grew up shouldn't matter. Like people should have equal opportunities across the country, and whether you decide to move to London or not later, that's like a different thing. Is a selection issue that will affect your prospects, will affect your income. But here we are looking into how does your origin factor into this? So we need better data. We need more estimates to be able to even look into, have people moved and what happened to the people who have moved versus who have stayed. Perhaps this is different between someone who moved away from London or someone who moved to London. But we have nothing on this yet.
Sorry, I got cut off in my question. You've probably answered it already.
No, we stopped talking about it because we decided to wait for you to come back.
You may have touched on it. There was two parts of my question. Was one about the length of the period that and there was during this period a financial crash, and that is quite relevant in the sense that we are thinking about going forward behind another crash, which is the COVID crash, which has clearly had differential impacts. So is there any evidence that, that's my first question, about over this period, were there changes in the experience, particularly pre and post the financial crash? And my second question was about over this period, participation in higher education increased quite significantly, and the extent to which this had an impact, and had an impact differentially between different parts of the country, insofar as there was more demand for graduate labour and therefore opportunities for progression in the south than there was in the north. So two two in a way related questions. Thank you.
So the first question, I think we don't know yet. So in this data set, I haven't tried to look into post and pre-2008 crash, but perhaps that would be an interesting thing to do. I don't know if the sample allows us to divide the people like that, to have meaningful sample sizes still. But the idea that we have is that this kind of crashes, they make it harder for, especially for disadvantaged people, to have good opportunities. So with COVID as well, what I've been seeing in the recent debates is that it's probably going to get worse, and social mobility is getting forgotten in this agenda. Now we carry about other kind of things, and the probability is that it will get worse, but we don't know yet. With the higher education participation, that's an interesting thing, and the hypothesis that more access to education being more spread out to everyone instead of just one group or the other, that would increase the prospects of social mobility for everyone. But what we have been seeing, or what this, for example, this other study has shown, was that the people who had the same education, but they were in regions that had very low social mobility prospects, they still had a big gap between the people from disadvantaged backgrounds or people from advantaged backgrounds, even though they were controlling for education. They were comparing people at the same level of education. So I think there are other factors in there that we talk a lot when we talk about social mobilities. A lot of this literature is related to, we need to expand education, we need to end grammar schools and make better schools for everyone. And this is true, but there are probably a lot of other factors at the local level specifically as well that come into play, and that we don't know exactly what they are yet.
Does the Leo data help in some respect here? Because that is, I mean, I've seen some studies, I can't remember precisely, about from the Leo data that young people who go and study in local universities, and particularly in less highly ranked universities, the post-92 universities, tend to stay local, get employed local, and occupation for occupation get paid less than those either that migrate to the south in a similar occupation, and those that remain and tend to go into lower income groups. I mean, so have you looked at any of the Leo data in this respect?
No, I haven't. I don't have access to the Leo data yet, but this study, I think they're trying to do this in the Social Mobility Commission. I think this first report that just came out in September, that was the first picture of what they could find with the Leo data, but I think they're probably trying to go into a little bit further into that and see this kind of things. I have seen, I think, this kind of similar study of the local universities and what people study, where they stay, things like that. So it's definitely a possibility. The problem with the Leo data that I see is that the link between generations is very weak. So we have, for the parental generation here, we only have information on school meals eligibility. So we don't have exactly the income of the parents.
Right.
And it's only at one age as well. So school meal eligibility when these kids were 16, yes, that is a proxy, but I don't know if that's like a good enough proxy to do the intergenerational study.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, Denise. Can you ask a question now?
Thanks, Raquel. Thanks very much, Bertha, for a great presentation. I was just wondering whether you had a chance to explore how the patterns of social mobility among some ethnic minority groups. But I noticed that after seeing your final slide, this is probably a part of your future research agenda. So given your familiarity with the data set, do you think it's possible to look into this by, conceptualizing cultural diversity, for example, by looking into their country of birth, ethnicity, religion, or language?
Yes, so this is something I really want to do, and it's in my plans. So the Understanding Society is still ongoing, the survey. So every year in November, we get new waves of this data set. And I think like right now, it's still not long enough because we need this many years of separation to be able to look at the two generations inside the data set. But soon it will be long enough to be able to do that only using the Understanding Society sample, which means that we are able to look into ethnic groups as well. Because the problem with the BHPS is that the sample sizes of some of these ethnic minority groups, they were so small that not representative of the groups. So yeah, I think there's definitely will be a difference. I think there is a 2020 paper by Chetty. He's the one that does all his research in the US. And he did this looking at blacks and whites in the US, and the prospects are quite different for these two groups. So I think it would be definitely interesting here in the UK. You have all the story with the Black Caribbean background people and other South Asian kind of origins that I think it would, yeah, it's something that's definitely in the agenda and would be interesting.
Thank you.
Thank you. Claire, do you have any question?
Yes, please. Thanks for an interesting presentation. So I have two questions, if I may. They're both kind of related to sample size issues, I guess. So the first is, obviously, you've alluded to it in your answer to the last question. You don't observe many people up to age 40, which is typically when the largest correlations are found between parents and children. To what extent do you think that might be biasing downwards, the estimates that you're finding? I know you were doing some work to try and account for age effects, but obviously the main problem is you just don't observe many people up to age 40 amongst the children.
Yes.
And the second, sorry, I'll just ask the second question, which was just, so I think the region results you presented are really interesting. I guess I'm just wondering how many parents there are at different points of the income distribution in the different regions, like how kind of, I guess, precise do you think the estimates are? And I'm guessing you might struggle to find statistically significant differences, perhaps except amongst the kind of highest and lowest regions of mobility.
Yes, so you're right in both of these issues. So basically in the paper, there is a whole section discussing how this is probably still a lower bound estimate of what it would be the true value of this coefficient of the elasticity or the rank coefficients, because they're of both issues of the measurement of permanent income, and because these people are still relatively young. What I did in the PhD, I could estimate for different ages. So I went doing sample restrictions up to like age 32, 34, and I didn't observe a big change in the coefficients that I was estimating. So I think we do quite a good job here controlling for the age and the cohort and the time effects. And while it still could be biased downwards, that's the best we could do, and we need to do more to know exactly. Your second point, the sample sizes, they were big enough to get statistically different from zero coefficient. However, you're right that to get into the sense that the regions different between themselves, then we do have that, yeah, the highest and the lowest, yes, they're different, but in the middle, the confidence intervals just get a lot bigger. And this was the same problem, I think, that they had in the Social Mobility Commission report when they were looking into local authorities. Yes, they did find very different point estimates, but are they actually different? The only way I think that we can go around these issues would be when we have administrative data like they do in Sweden or in Norway, to be able to have like a lot of people in each area. So here, that was one of the reasons why I tried to keep quite aggregated still and had the North and South, because I think there are things there to be explored in the future when we have data that allow us to do that.
Yeah, thank you very much. Tassos?
Yes, thank you very much. Thank you, Bertha. This was very interesting, and having known a little bit about putting together BHPS and these datasets, there's immense work just to clean it and put it together, let alone everything else. So thank you for that. I just have a question about the difference between North and South, and I was thinking maybe I missed something, how prices come into this. So for example, the London weighting in wages, which gives an extra 3,000 for a lot of people compared to similar jobs in the North, say, for example. Would this mean that people in the South have higher wages for the same job to account for housing prices or cost of living, let's say, than the people in the North? And if this has changed in the last generation or 20 years that you are observing, would this explain part of the differences that you see in the South versus the North in terms of mobility? Because I think your mobility measure is measured in the whole of the country, right? So if wages in the South go up more than wages in the North, just on the basis of cost of living, then the comparison to the average, the ranking of people in the South will have gone up. But I may have missed something, or you may have control about this.
No, so there are two issues there. One is that these regions, they are the region of upbringing. So this comes back to the other point. We don't know exactly where these people live now. To be able to know, like, are they earning their wage in London? Are they earning that wage in another place? So this is something we definitely need to do. And there is only very recent as well. I was doing some work with some people at the World Bank. They're trying to look into how using different price indices, because this is all deflated, obviously, over time. We have a comparable measure of income for the whole country, but we know that the prices vary a lot in different regions. But how does this affect or bias our estimates? It can go both ways, and it's like a very new area of research, but definitely we need to, I think, look into where these people are. Have they moved? Have they not moved? And cost of living as well. Here, what we have is like a very broad measure of household income. Yes, we deflated it to compare it, but yeah, you're right. You didn't miss anything.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. Ted?
Hi there, thanks, really interesting talk. Yeah, so I've kind of got two questions. One of them is relates a bit to what you were saying before about administrative data. And I was just wondering if you know if there's any realistic prospect of that happening. You know, you kind of see all this kind of great data in other countries, Raj Chetty's type stuff. Do you have any idea? Maybe it's kind of outside your scope really, but I'm wondering if you knew that prospect was a realistic one, or, you know, kind of what the hold up is to doing that bit of work, which I think would be great. And the second question I've got is really kind of related to this kind of trend in mobility over time. And I was wondering if you cannot extract that from your data. You have quite a long panel, and couldn't you kind of compare the start and end of the panel to get an idea of the trend in recent times?
So just answer your second question first. I did that, and it's a similar thing with the regions. So what I found was actually there wasn't a big difference between, I did it like for every year that I had and groups of 5 years, and I didn't see any, the estimates were not different from each other in the, like a little bit here and there, but like not significantly different over these 27 years of time, which makes me think it's perhaps more constant, or that we need to account for issues like Tassos was bringing of these differences in price levels across the country, something like that. Did that answer your second question? I think.
Yeah,
perhaps.
kind of.
And the first one, I think we're all hoping, and they're saying, I've seen this recent paper saying, yeah, soon we will have some administrative data, but I haven't heard of anything concrete on the way. So perhaps that will take some more years of working with what we have before we can get to Scandinavian levels of data.
Thank you very much. I have a very short question that I think relates a bit with Tasso's question. That is, in these methodologies, how do they control for the intra-regional inequality? You know, because I think that these measures are very much put together looking at the average, isn't it? But if we think about the intra-regional inequality in the south, comparing with the intra-regional inequality in parts of the north, it is very big. It's a very big difference, and I think that this has also an influence in the ranking, and also in how you compare those aggregate somehow measures that you get. So I don't know, maybe you can elaborate a bit.
So here I didn't, like, this wasn't something I could do. Anything that was within these big regions was kind of out of control here with the data. And even this other recent report on the local authorities, I don't think they can, what they see is, yeah, we have different point estimates of these two measures, the same measures that I was showing, the rank coefficients and the upwards mobility for the parents at the 25th percentile. But are they different? They don't know. And definitely, I think, if you think London has probably one of the biggest intra-regional inequalities of the country, you have very, very poor areas like just there, and the richest parts of the country as well. But I think we are at a point where we can only look at averages, and hopefully when we have some more data and we can look into these other things. But yeah.
Yeah, we have Philip wants to make a question. I'm asking him to be a very short question because we are running out of time. So please, Philip.
Hello, Bertha.
Hi.
Just a very quick question. If I think maybe 10 or 15 years ago, before there was any serious data of this form, or the kind of analysis you're doing, many people would have just said, well, it's just about skills and education. So basically you sort out the education, you sort out the skills, and then a lot of these things will kind of disappear. They'll work out through the market mechanisms. Whereas the work that you've done, and also the work of the Social Mobility Commission, shows that the weaker is the locality, the lower you go down in terms of the prosperity, the productivity of the place, and the lower the income group that you're part of, the lower is the ability of skills or education to explain things. The things which become more unexplainable are inversely related to the skills levels. So in high skills environments, most of what you see in terms of how the economy operates is kind of explained by human capital, skills, etc. Whereas in the kind of places, many of which that you're looking at, that becomes more and more difficult. So one view of the argument is simply, if you take someone like Paul Collier, he would say, yes, that's true. The problem is, even if you have the skills, the jobs aren't there. It doesn't matter how much you train people. If the investment's not going to come in because of other reasons to do with banking systems or whatever, then supply side issues in terms of skills and education are not going to get very far. In fact, any improvements in the skills system is going to actually benefit the richer places relatively more than the weaker places. So I just wondered if you had a comment on that, given what the kind of things you've been doing.
No, well, like, I think you're completely right that there's probably a lot of factors that are, I think, beyond education here, because in the past few many years. There's still a lot of progress to be made in terms of education inequalities, yes, but that has been the main area of focus. And we still see that we're still kind of stuck in similar levels of income in intergenerational inequality. Yeah, so I think we need to start thinking about these things at the local level. What is the, one of the questions is, what is the ideal local level to be looking at? Is it a bigger region, or is it like a local authority region? Who has the power to decide on these things, and that would matter. And we do need to do some more research, like in the likes of what Chetty has been doing, and Acchiari and others in Italy as well. What other characteristics of these local regions are seen in the prosperous regions, or in the regions that are stuck behind? Is it segregation of any kind? Is it lack of infrastructure? Is it something that happens to the families there? So there are a lot of things that come into play, and that even if we have education that's the same for everybody, people will still have different outcomes later on. So I think that's the direction where this is headed, like more smaller regions. What is the ideal local area that we are supposed to be looking at for policy purposes? And how can we find the mechanisms that are actually going to make an influence here and break the cycle of high inequality, low prospects, high inequality, low prospects?
Thank you very much. Stan
Hello. Hello. We've done one of these for the Netherlands recently. We were fortunate in having administrative data, so we had about 70,000 people.
Oh, wow.
But we found, and we didn't exploit this, we found that the relationship wasn't linear. There was faster regression to the mean. There was more intergenerational mobility for people from richer families. I think you've got, your equation is a linear one, isn't it?
It is a linear. So I did, in my PhD thesis, I looked into transition matrices, and then I did conditional quantile regressions and unconditional quantile regressions to be able to look into any non-linearities. And I didn't find any significant differences, let's say, between the 10th percentile. So I only had 5 groups here, which was the limit that I could divide my data to a meaningful extent. But there weren't any statistically significant differences between our coefficients in these 5 quantiles that we had.
Because it makes sense to think that the richer families have more mobility. Because if you're at the bottom, with, as Paul Collier said, or was it Philip McCann said, if there are no jobs, you can't get anywhere. Your parents might be on welfare, you go onto welfare. How on earth can you get out of that trap? Whereas in London, the world's your oyster. It might be welfare.
And the rich people have a lot of resources that not only economic, I mean, networks and all these kind of things that.
But in London, the rich people it doesn't matter so much if your parents are rich. That's what you found. And that's fantastically interesting. We've got all these data for Holland, and we didn't even look at the regional side. It might be welfare. There aren't the jobs in the north.
It would definitely be worth linking the regional approach with this linearity.
There isn't anywhere to go if there isn't the work. There were no jobs.
Well, I have to say that has been very interesting. You can see also for so many questions, and I just also encourage everyone that has questions that has not been formulated here to send an email to Bertha. And of course, maybe Bertha and Stan, they want to collaborate together and maybe discuss the Dutch data in a regional level together. That could be.
I'll send you our paper, Bertha. Thank you.
Thank you. That would be amazing. Very interested.
Well, thank you very much to everybody to join us today, and I hope to see you all in the next seminar very soon. Bye now.